Welcome to the Erasing Shame Podcast, Season 1. This podcast is about erasing shame through honest talk for healthy living, emotionally, relationally, mentally, and personally. Visit our website at erasingshame.com for links to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and subscribe on iTunes and YouTube. Now, let's have an honest talk for healthy living.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to our podcast, Erasing Shame, Honest Talk for Healthy Living. I'm your host today, Eunice Lee, and I am joined by our guest, Dr. Martin Hsia. Martin is a clinical psychologist and health consultant. He specializes in helping people overcome anxiety in all forms, including obsessive compulsive disorder and insomnia. He practices the cognitive behavioral therapy of Southern California in Glendale, California, and hosts the podcast Psych Rally. So thanks so much for coming today, Martin. We're going to talk a little bit about anxiety and shame. We've talked a little bit beforehand, but I would love for you to just describe what you do professionally, what your areas of passion are, and just a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, well, first, thank you for having me, Younis. We met recently, but seem to have known each other through other people for a lot longer. And I just think what you and DJ have done so far, from what I've read and heard, is really, really good. So I'm very honored to be invited to be part of this. I'm a psychologist, as you said. I'm a therapist. Throughout my career to date, I've been very fortunate to have a lot of unique experiences and develop specialty training and work in lots of different areas. I worked with at the VA with veterans with post-traumatic stress. I've worked with people with gambling problems, gambling addictions. I've previously worked in a practice with a lot of kids and teens dealing with attention problems and learning problems, helping parents deal with the homework battles and screen time and all that stuff. But really, my focus now and the practice that I work at is, as you said, probably 60-70% of the people that we help are dealing with some kind of anxiety, primary anxiety. That might be social anxiety, panic episodes, phobias, health and illness related, and most specifically OCD, which also can come in a number of forms. And sleep, as you mentioned, insomnia. Obviously, we address all of that as psychologists. We deal with it from a non-medication based perspective, and that's really valuable for a lot of people. So that's my passion. I'm like you, I'm a therapist, and but those are my specialties, the practice I work at.
Yeah, that's really cool. So do you see I'm wondering if you see an epidemic of anxiety or even of OCD in the work that you do?
Well, I do, because that's a large part of a large percentage of people that come to us. Plenty of reasons to be anxious and stressed in any of our lives if we really want to focus on it. I think the challenge with people where anxiety really becomes a problem is that we can get fixated on it. We might not be dealing with it in a healthy, productive way, talking about it, confronting it. Anxiety really grows when we avoid it. And OCD is one major form of that, in which we can develop what we call compulsions, which are ways, kind of ritualistic and rigid ways of getting rid of unwanted, intrusive, scary thoughts. Plenty of things to be anxious about all the time. Natural disasters, political, financial, health, etc., if we really want to. So there's always plenty of work to do.
Yeah, very cool. And I just wondered, because I've seen, and you've been practicing longer than I have, but I've seen kind of more anxiety these days than I would say depression. And you're right, there's a lot of things to be anxious about. Kind of the working definition, and I know you mentioned that you've listened to our podcast before, but the way that we describe shame here, and you can feel free to add your own spin to it or completely disagree, but it's kind of taking off of what Brene Brown says, which is that guilt is that you did something wrong, shame is that you are wrong, or guilt is that you made a mistake, shame is that you are the mistake. And so it's kind of to put the spin on this, because DJ and I talk a lot about what shame is from an Asian American collectivist context, which is that it's as if everybody is in agreement that you should feel shame. It's not just your perspective or in your head. There's also a collective agreement that that's something that's bad. So I'm wondering for you, and I know you don't work just with a specific culture. This is something that impacts everybody. But yeah, how would you understand or define shame from your background and from how you work and who you work with?
Yeah, I mean, first thing I would say is just from what I've listened to and watched already, from what you and DJ have done on just what this is, 5 or 6 episodes in this podcast. I mean,
7 already, I think. Yeah.
7, yeah. I mean, I think you folks have done a really good job defining it, covering it from different angles, different aspects of it. And I was telling you this earlier before we hit record, that, shame, it's interesting because it's not a clinical term. It's not a sort of symptom or thing that you hear in our diagnostic and statistical manual, but it's a word that everybody knows colloquially. And I think maybe just a couple of the things that I've been thinking about on the topic of shame while knowing that we were going to be talking about this is, I think sometimes there's an important distinction between sort of shame that happens between people, like public or social shame, like shame on you, or you should be ashamed of yourself, kind of losing face.
Yeah.
Which can be sort of reacted to or rejected. And then there's sort of personal, internal shame that you or me or anyone can carry around with us, even in the absence of another person. And that can really sort of shape and influence how we see ourselves and how we interact with the world and other people too. A few months ago, there was a story in the NFL, and there's a quarterback named Cam Newton who, it was very unfortunate. He, and after a game, in a post-game media conference, he made some very, very sloppy and unfortunate sexist remarks. And, of course, the media and Twitter and the NFL kind of came out, denouncing those remarks and being critical. And not long after that, I saw an interview of, some ESPN sports commentators talking. And one of them was a woman named Sam Ponder, a female sports commentator. And, she would have been well within her right to just be outraged and go all out on Cam Newton's comments. But what she did with it was actually really, I promised on the topic of shame, but was very, I think, pithy and articulate. And basically what she said is, I could call him out and just criticize him and come down on his comments, call him, whatever it is. But then I'd just be perpetuating the cycle of criticism and fear and anger and hate. And then I'm stooping to that level. So she said, what I'll do instead is and she said this, she said, shame alone makes people hide, not change. And that it's really relationship and exposure and conversation over time that opens up minds and changes hearts. And I just thought that was very big-hearted and graceful of her, and kind of illustrated this point of how, shame can restrict and it causes us to hide and brings about fear and pressure in not a encouraging, uplifting way.
Oh, totally.
Yeah.
I really like what she said too about how, there's the opposite of that is what kind of brings understanding and healing. Yeah. And we need that in order to thrive and to heal. So from what I'm
we know that as therapists too, what we do.
Yeah. And so it sounds like there's kind of 2 types that you outline, which I really like. It's the relationship we have with others, and then the relationship we have with ourselves.
Yeah.
And shame can live in both of those things. And I think sometimes we either live too much in one or the other, where we think shame is all in our head or shame is all between people. But I like the distinction you made.
Well, and I think it could be very much both and they can certainly intertwine based on the people in our lives and the choices we make too.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm thinking with specific compulsions, like, for example, skin picking, trichotillomania, or hair pulling, these like kind of little things that impact people on the daily basis that I've known people with these things, and it's been tough for them to even come out, much less some of the deeper compulsions or deeper obsessions or social anxiety or panic disorder. I mean, how does that play into your work when working with clients that have these compulsions or these anxious behaviors?
Boy, yeah. Well, I think, you hit on some good examples. I'll share a couple others. I mean, you can, let's think of OCD. If you are this shouldn't be too hard. If you're a recent mother, first time having a baby, and you are holding this precious, dependent, innocent, beautiful little thing that you love and you're bonding with and you're nursing, just a couple days old, and then all of a sudden you start having thoughts of how easy it would be to drown this baby while giving him or her a bath. And then you think, why am I having this? I don't want to do that. But then, well, let me stop thinking about this. And then we get into this cycle of having a thought and avoiding it, thinking that I might really want to do that. And then like, what kind of mother am I that I'm having this thought? Right? And the shame that can be attached with that.
Yeah.
Another example would be, imagine if you're a high profile minister or spiritual leader, priest or pastor, and then you just start having thoughts for whatever reason that I'm going to go to hell if I don't say a prayer a certain way or a certain number of times, and my salvation is in jeopardy if it doesn't feel right. And I've got to do it just right and do it over and over until I get it right. And then I feel better until I have that thought again. I've got to do it again. Right? We've had highly educated, successful people, surgeons, you lose your job because you spend too long scrubbing up. You got to clean because the fears of contamination have taken over your life to the point where the ritualistic compulsion to wash just a certain number of times or a certain way until it feels quite right takes over, and then it's not practical to your life. And so you can imagine the shame in it looks a little bit different in each of these circumstances, but these are, variations of real things that we've seen. Yeah.
So, and I mean, even the first example you gave, I mean, I'm a new mom. I feel like that's a lot of people's postpartum experience. So I'm really glad that you're able to outline that.
Sure.
And I'm wondering, so it sounds like what you're saying is that shame is it's living inside all these examples, that it's part of that cycle.
Yeah, I think what I would say is that, just the effects of any of these things taking time and effort and energy, and this thing that I feel like I've got to hide, that maybe I'm right. It takes time and it affects our emotions, and then we start to question ourselves, and makes it hard for us to get better. That in and of itself can cause a feeling of shame, because shame has everything to do with sort of achievement and results, and at least the guise of perfection. And what happens if I am not? What happens if I'm on paper, people think of me a certain way, but I'm really dealing with something very difficult. The other thing is that, sorry, go ahead.
Oh yeah, I just feel like that even touches on that whole idea of imposter syndrome, or kind of living that double life, is the anxiety plus this kind of external on paper person.
Exactly.
So, interesting. You were saying?
I also think, this whole idea of everything's got to be perfect or look intact, right? And OCD it's a similar thing in that we might we feel like I don't have control over my own mind if I'm having these unwanted, intrusive, unpleasant images and thoughts. I mean, some of the most famous books on OCD it's telling in the title, Imp of the Mind, Brain Lock, The Doubting Disease, and part of you recognizes that these thoughts are not logical, but you can't stop having them. And so one of the hallmarks components of OCD and why it maintains itself and spreads is avoidance, is the desire to want to avoid that thought or get rid of it or suppress it or do some compulsion or ritualize to kind of neutralize it. But that only works in the short term. It doesn't work in the long term. And similarly with shame, right? It makes us want to avoid and hide rather than bring something into the light or address it directly in a vulnerable way, which is what we need to be able to do to heal from shame. Yeah. So in that way, I think they're similar.
So, there's some echo. So for example, how would you disarm those clients that you were describing that, are having these intrusive thoughts, these anxious thoughts, panicking? How would you help them, like as a clinician, as a therapist?
Sure. Well, obviously I guess the specifics of that look so different for each person in each case, of course. But largely speaking, I think with anxiety and OCD, people don't come to therapy until they're really ready for something to be different, until they're really sick of things the way they are. They want something to change and they're willing to do something about it. But I think with anxiety and OCD, there's motivation, but there also needs to be a very accurate sort of understanding and conceptualization of what it is the person's dealing with. And someone really needs to sort of be given a sense and an understanding that just because I'm having these thoughts doesn't make them real. Doesn't mean that they actually reflect a reality or something I actually want to do or something that I actually have done. We've all had sort of weird dreams before, taboo things of, violent, sexual, embarrassing, showing up to class without pants on, whatever it is, shame related. But then, we wake up and we say, oh, that was weird, but at least that was a dream, right? And somehow we kind of write them off. Well, what happens if we're having those thoughts in a waking state? And that's what someone with OCD is dealing with. And they say, well, and somehow, because it's happening in a waking state, we might attach more meaning to it and say, well, that must mean something different. And so we have to help people really understand that accurately. We have to help people understand and accept those thoughts with self-compassion, with mindfulness, knowing that that's that the meaning we place on those thoughts may not be accurate or real. But really the meat of working with OCD and anxiety is exposure. And for OCD, we call it exposure with response prevention, which, long story short, is basically coaching and helping people to confront and face the fears, thoughts, places, situations that are triggering that fear and anxiety, to do the things that we're afraid of. It is very scary, absolutely. But that's why the education and the helping them understand that this is actually going to help them. We're helping them experience short-term pain in the service of longer-term gain. Versus if you're doing the compulsion over and over, it feels like short-term gain, but it's really longer-term pain because then you've got to do it over and over. So it's the opposite. So
I feel like that's really important too when it comes to shame work, is that in the short term, it feels more painful to approach it and to confront it. But in the longer term, there's more freedom. And that's kind of what we're hoping to do with this podcast. And it sounds like that's what you get to do every day with your clients.
I'd like to think of it that way. I mean, it's can be difficult work. And as you said, it's very scary for clients to deal with. But, things don't necessarily change overnight by any means. But, it's very rewarding work, and to help people and to see, be part of people's journey from being, closed off in their own house, isolated from other people, having lost jobs, marriages, and then be able to be living their lives again. I mean, that's rewarding work.
Well, I've a question for you in terms of, as we compare, as you talk about what you do with anxiety and OCD, and as we talk about shame, I'm seeing there's so many parallels. And so I'm curious for you, if someone were listening that had certain, patterns that you might define as OCD anxiety, but just didn't know, they just thought that's what life was like. How would you kind of describe it or help them understand that they might have anxiety or OCD?
Yeah. I guess the funny thing is the way you asked that, Younis, is like, I think for the most part, people who are dealing with anxiety know they're dealing with anxiety because it's uncomfortable. The temperature is hot and I want to get out of this. And the best way that typically people with anxiety know, the most natural response is to avoid the thing that makes me feel anxious. Whether that's a thought or an image or a place or a reminder of something, a place where I had a panic episode, a situation that involves other people where I felt judged or nervous. So typically, I mean, people know that something's wrong. And especially if it's, again, taking up real estate in their lives, inhibiting them from working towards goals that they might have personally, professionally, relationally. This is where the shame piece comes in. Right. Another place where it comes in is like, everyone says that I am, capable and smart and attractive or whatever, and I'm not meeting my potential, or life isn't happening along my timeline or the way along the time frame that I expected. And then I feel shame about that. Right. And
I bet a lot of transitional young adults and 20s people can relate to that.
20s, 30s, 40s, us in different ways.
Just humans,
as humans. But when anxiety and OCD really has a hold on someone's life, I mean, it can really restrict things even more. And so I think, to tie things together, I'd say, there's a stigma about mental health issues. There's a stigma about getting help. about getting to therapy. I think that's changing and different in some circles, but even I know, I mean, even being in a big city like LA, there's stigma. Some people are okay with it, but a lot of people like, oh, I'm not crazy. I don't need help. I'm going to seek a professional. And, I think sometimes that's true. There are a lot of things that we can improve and get better on and change with making good life decisions and taking care of our health and relying on support of good family and friends. But there's a lot of things that I think really do benefit from professional help. And really, it's not either or. It could be both and. I mean, you can have all the great support and tools around you. But I'd like to think that the right professional and the right help at the right time can really expedite the process of recovery and getting better and taking one's life back.
Yeah, definitely. So what would you say to people that are on the fence about therapy?
Watch the Moments of Meaning videos on YouTube. That's one thing. I don't know if I told you about this, Younis. Myself and a few other colleagues in the Pasadena area took de-identified stories of things that have happened in therapy and sort of told them live. And they were recorded and edited and put online. So they're on YouTube, Moments of Meaning. We, on Psych Rally, the show that I do, the podcast, I've had people tell their own stories of recovery, dealing with various things, gambling, alcoholism, trichotillomania, post-traumatic stress, and how therapy has helped them. There's no shame in it. And you and I know, I mean, as therapists, we see it as sacred territory, as a sacred conversation. Yeah. And so, everything we talk about is private. We're professional secret keepers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that point is so interesting because I've had people ask me before when they find out what I do professionally, ask, how is that different from talking to a friend? Or even, does that mean that the people you talk to or, going to therapy means you don't have friends? Like, shouldn't that be what friends are for? But it's such a different feeling when you're there and you're sitting across from someone and you're seeing them and you're meeting them and you're letting them meet themselves for the first time, that I think that there's so much more kind of richness in that. I think that we should all be able to experience those sacred moments together.
Sure. Yeah. And I think, a friendship is reciprocal. Like if I'm going to, if I'm going to make 1 hour you and me talking and it's all about me and we do that over and over again, at some point I'm going to wear you down. I mean, unless we trade hours perhaps, but with therapy, it's definitely personal because we're talking about very precious, sensitive, vulnerable, personal things, but it's at the end of the day, it's a professional relationship. We're still, hired. And I also think, people say that there's something about like this space, this place, this time, and this person that I go to talk with. It's just about me. And that might seem, egotistical or narcissistic, but there's a reason why we do what we do and people come to us because that's something special. I mean, what if family and friends, which is often the case, is the reason why people are coming to therapy? I don't have someone to listen to provide an outside third party, let alone a trained professional to give an outside input that could help me. So,
yeah, that's a great point. Yeah. And I think that's a lot of, I see a lot of young adults, and that's sometimes what it is they come in because it's really hard to figure out how to launch with parents that can't let go or with family members that are really difficult to be with. And so I think that's a really good point. And
add another piece, Younis, with younger folks, I should say, in teens and 20s is, what if most of my meaningful interactions are over text or over Instagram? And, it's a different form of communication. And sometimes I kind of just want to have a space to put my thoughts into words and have them not be processed and not worry how it's going to sound. And therapy, especially in a face-to-face, real life human interaction, it provides something different than that. So.
Yeah. It sounds like, especially what you do with, walking someone through encountering and confronting some of their compulsions, that's not something that just anyone can do. It has to be a safe space and has to be professional, because that'd be really tough to just do that for a friend. So
I'd like to think so.
Yeah. If there are listeners that have loved ones who can relate to this, these anxiety issues, what would you tell them about helping the people in their lives that may have anxiety issues? So say like I had a brother who has anxiety, how could I help him?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's helpful, as you said, it's different from therapy, but certainly the support and the gentle, loving challenge of someone who is trusted and respected and cares really matters. Mm-hmm. And, if you were to say to your hypothetical brother, like, I see the ways that these habits or things that I'm observing or things that you've shared with me are really, really affecting you. And, I've learned some things about anxiety. There are resources online. There's the ADAA, Association for Depression and Anxiety. There's IOCDF, International OCD Foundation. There's just lots of resources and things online. Blogs. Our practice, CBT SoCal, has a blog where we talk about OCD and anxiety and treatment. So I think information is helpful. Also having, it's sort of a balance of giving people both the support and the understanding and the encouragement, even if you're not in the therapist role, but also the gentle nudge to say, like, I'm concerned about you, and like, I would love to see you get the right help so that this doesn't, continue to impact your life adversely.
Yeah, totally. Great. Yeah. Well, in terms of shame and, OCD, anxiety, and then shame too, I'm curious, DJ and I talk a lot about Asian American culture because we both happen to be Asian American, and as you are as well. And I'm curious of what your thoughts are about anxiety in the way that, Asian Americans tend to parent, tend to engage with their children, tend to attune to their kids or to connect with their kids. I mean, are you seeing any patterns in our culture?
Boy, yeah, it's a tricky one because, you and DJ know this, right? Even being Asian American means so many different things. It's not a monolithic thing.
Totally.
And it's also tricky because, by and large, Asian Americans don't go to therapy much, right? I think that, again, that changes more with different generations, right? I would say third and fourth generation Asian Americans are more likely and inclined to go to therapy than a second generation. Was more inclined to go than a first generation who probably, less likely to even have a context for what therapy is, let alone any, sense of it as a credible profession. But I think I've said this before in other places that, I think what I find in my role professionally is that Asian Americans tend more to be motivated to come to something like therapy when I've been working with people with gambling problems, because it directly affects
that's a big
money, and oftentimes through 1-800-GAMBLER they can get it paid for sometimes. So it's a free service, and when it involves the kids and education, right? So and that's and at one level that's not unique to Asian Americans. A lot of people are, more motivated to seek services and help and invest in things that are going to help their kids than they might for themselves as adults. But I think for Asian Americans, I feel like that separation is even greater in general, right?
Yeah.
Like, kid struggling in school has an attention problem or has anxiety, and the teacher said to get help, like, oh, okay, I'm more likely to do that than I will to, address my own issues in a setting like therapy.
Yeah. I think that it's interesting to see how, and Liz Lynn, who we're having on next week, she wrote a blog about how there's no one story when it comes to, any group, any minority group. But there are patterns. And so it's interesting to hear. I know with gambling, that's a huge issue in the Asian American communities. I know I remember hearing that they have advertising in Chinese and Korean, and they send buses straight to Vegas from, Monterey Park, California, where there's a high Chinese population, Asian American population. And so there's definitely, it sounds like some patterns, but not everybody fits the kind of strict, stringent cookie cutter prototype of what it means to be Asian American, but it does exist in our culture.
Yeah, and it's weird. Speaking of gambling, it's a very acceptable and sanctioned form of recreation. If you go to Macau and Hong Kong or outside of Hong Kong, it's huge rows and city of casino, so it's just built in. And you come here, that's what So it might not have the stigma attached to it, and like, you know, eating disorders and alcoholism, like there's not a label for that in some Asian cultures in Scotland and Ireland. People think about these things very differently. So
that's interesting. Yeah. Very cool.
So.
All right. Well, I think that we're already at the end of our time. I just want to share some of the resources that that you have, which is first your podcast, psychrallypodcast.com, and then your website, cbtsocal.com. And then we're also adding on our Facebook link, the Moments of Meaning YouTube videos, which I'm excited to watch and to get into. And then you can always come, for the listeners, you can always visit our website at erasingshame.com, where you'll find our Facebook page, YouTube, and our podcast on iTunes. So you can catch up with all of the great content we have. Thank you so much, Martin, for coming on and just sharing your wisdom. And I'm curious, do you have any last thoughts before we finish up here?
No, I think we covered it. Feel free to have people contact me if they've got other questions about OCD or anxiety. So very grateful to be part of the show. I love what you and DJ are doing. So I look forward to watching more myself.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Martin. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Have a good night. Bye.
Good.